Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Just want to make sure everybody's still awake. All right, I want to thank you all for coming out to the Holland Land Office tonight for our guest speaker series. This is one of our bigger crowds, so congrats to you. Almost used all our chairs, so almost at capacity. Guest Speaker Series is a program we started a few years ago, and we're still going strong. We do about 2 a month. This month we've done 4, so, you know, we're glutton for punishment. But we're very excited. This year, again, we're supported in part through a DEC grant through New York State, administered by Pawlak, so we thank you to them for helping us bring in wonderful speakers like Kevin. So the man of the hour, he even came to us wounded, so true soldier over here. So, but Kevin came to us all the way from Virginia, where he's done so many different battlefields. I won't even name them off because I'll be here all night. But
I can name it.
there you go. But tonight he's going to talk about Bull Run and some of the units and soldiers from right here in our own backyard. Kevin?
Thank you, Ryan. This thing's on, I guess. Okay, I'm used to screaming out on a battlefield, so you should all be able to hear me, even if I'm mic'd up or not. But thank you all very much for coming out this evening. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces, some new faces as well. And it really is great to be home and to be able to share stories of people from here that are now down where I am living. So just a real quick background of me. How many of you were here when I did Western New York at Antietam? It means I did an okay job, I guess. Got a few so that's good. But what's good for Ryan, I guess, is I can just keep doing Western New York at all these different battlefields throughout Virginia because they were everywhere. They were all over the place. So what I'm going to do tonight, for those of you who have at least a basic knowledge of the Civil War, you've probably at least heard of Bull Run, also referred to as Manassas, and I'll get into the distinction between the two. But there were actually 2 battles that were fought on the very same ground during the Civil War. The first one was the first major battle of the war, fought on July 21st, 1861. So we're 3 days past the 163rd anniversary of that. And then the second was fought 13 months later in August of 1862. So we're not going to go into great detail about the battles tonight. What I want to do is spend some time examining some local stories that relate to the area. I tried to pick from Batavia as best as I possibly could, but there are only so many stories from around here. So some of the greater Western New York area. 3 stories from first Bull Run in July 1861, and then 2 from second in August of 1862. So this is Manassas National Battlefield. This is actually a picture that I took. I don't fashion myself as a photographer by any stretch of the imagination, but I was up there. Thankfully, I live only 10 minutes south of the battlefield. This is Henry Hill, or Henry House Hill, as it came to be known during the Civil War, where really both battles came to an end, a climactic end. For those of you who might be familiar with some of the stories of this place, what you're looking at there is the Stonewall Jackson Monument that was erected in 1940. How many of you have been to Manassas National Battlefield, by the way? Okay, a few of you. So if you see Stonewall Jackson, by the way, I refer to him as Stonewall Schwarzenegger. He has huge muscles. He's much larger than the real-life Stonewall Jackson actually was. But this just gives you an idea of the landscape here. Manassas National Battlefield is really an incredible place. Before I even moved to Manassas, it was one of my favorite battlefields that I've ever been to. It's over 5,000 acres of green space within 25 miles of Washington, D.C. So that means that it gets a lot of recreational use, not a lot of historical use, unfortunately sometimes, and it is being constantly surrounded and squeezed by development. If you've ever been through Northern Virginia, I was talking with a few of you earlier, and I was thankful to get out of Northern Virginia on time this morning because you never know what traffic's going to be like down there as you're moving through on the way. So as I mentioned, 2 battles that are going to be fought here. This will show you the landscape a little bit of the Manassas area. So while today Manassas is the city of Manassas, and it's a rather large city of close to 50,000 people living in just the city part itself, and then there's more in the county part, which Virginia municipalities is a whole other topic we could go into, but we're not going to do that too much tonight. But nonetheless, Manassas was really nothing almost in 1861. It was really just a rail junction. That's it. Two railroads came together, one that went roughly northeast to southwest into the interior of Virginia, and one went basically due west from Manassas. So the junction is down here at the bottom of the map. And the other railroad, the Manassas Gap Railroad, went west out toward the Shenandoah Valley. So that's the whole reason Manassas was strategic during the Civil War, is because of the railroads. Railroads could supply troops, you could use the railroads to move troops, etc. So when the Civil War began in the spring of 1861, the Confederate Army's idea was to defend the frontier of the entire Confederacy, so defend every inch of space of the Confederate States. Now, they very quickly realized that became impossible to do that. And so what they tried to do is find good defensive positions as close to the frontier as they possibly could. And the first defensive position in northern Virginia that they settled on was the position behind the banks of a sluggish stream called Bull Run, which you can see snaking its way through the middle of the map here. So that is the name that will lend itself, or give, that Union soldiers will call the action on July 21st. Confederate soldiers will name it the Battle of Manassas, after the railroad junction itself. So Confederate troops can protect the junction, again, which is down here, from behind Bull Run itself. So that's why they're there. And again, it's only 25 miles outside of our nation's capital. And so having an enemy force within 25 miles of the nation's capital is a good way to really stick it to Abraham Lincoln, who's at this point just 3 months into his presidency, a little over 3 months into his presidency at this point. So because of the fact that there's a body of Confederate soldiers within 25 miles of Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln caved to public pressure, raised an army of 35,000 soldiers, and I use that term loosely because by July 1861, most of these soldiers had never before fought on a battlefield, they had never been shot at before, and very few of them had ever even fired their guns before, coming onto the battlefield here. So these 35,000 men will be under the command of Irvin McDowell. This won't be on the test later on. You don't have to remember all the names, don't worry. But Irvin McDowell is probably best known for eating an entire watermelon in one sitting. And he did that more than July 21st and supposedly got sick from it. But nonetheless, he's going to be charged with leading this army of 35,000 men from out behind the defenses of Washington to drive the Confederate Army away, capture Manassas Junction, and as both sides pretty much thought that early on in the war, one big battle was going to decide it all. If the Union Army won, then the Confederacy is going to fall apart, and those Confederate states will rejoin the United States. If the Confederacy wins, then they will have their independence. And of course, as you already know, that's not exactly the way that it worked out. But when McDowell's army came to the north side of Bull Run, they came to a town of Centerville, which is now a big, almost a city. Today, I'll show you some pictures of it in a little bit, but his lead elements, the lead portion of his army was under the command of a fellow named Daniel Tyler, and Tyler was told to basically move south from Centerville and scout out the crossings of Bull Run in the direction of Manassas Junction. So again, he's going to move roughly down where you see this railroad. This railroad actually wasn't there in July 1861, but it came later on. But anyway, what's going to happen is Tyler's going to realize that he bit off a lot more than he could chew, and he's going to do exactly what Irvin McDowell did not want him to do, and that was to become engaged in a general battle along the banks of Bull Run that is known as the Battle of Blackburn's Ford, fought on July 18th of 1861. And here's where we get to our first local story. So one of the participants of the Battle of Blackburn's Ford was a soldier in the 12th New York State Militia, and his name was Charles Rand. Some of you may be familiar with that name if you read any of the signs coming in to this section of the museum. So Rand was born here in Batavia in January of 1839. He actually grew up on a house on Liberty Street, which is basically where the parking lot of T.F. Brown's is today. The home no longer stands, of course. His father died when he was 4 years old, and then when he became 16, Rand became a journalist. He actually moved down to New Orleans, where he worked for one of the major newspapers that was printing out of New Orleans before the Civil War, and then as sectional tensions increased in late 1860, Rand decided to move back home to Batavia. And on April 15th, 3 days after the first shots of the Civil War were fired, Rand was attending a conference of journalists at the Eagle Tavern, which no longer stands today, but it sat just behind the county courthouse today. This would be Ellicott Street here. You're looking down Main Street. So here's where the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial is today, and this was the Eagle Hotel where Charles Rand was. So basically right across from the Wendy's. Always got to put things in modern perspective, right? That's where everybody knows where things are. So while they're attending this conference, as the story goes, a telegram arrived announcing that President Abraham Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months to put down the rebellion in the southern states. And somebody asked, who is going to sign up? And supposedly, according to the story, Charles Rand was the first person to step forward and say, I will. And there's all sorts of debate about this, but because we're in Batavia, we're going to say it's true. He is accepted as being the first volunteer to answer Lincoln's call for 75,000 soldiers. And he did it just down the street from where we are. So he signed up as a member of the 12th New York State Militia. He would become engaged in the fighting at Blackburn's Ford. This is Blackburn's Ford today. So this is looking from the Fairfax County side. This is the Prince William County side. There's a giant, massive highway bridge right here. Pretty much the entire battlefield has been wiped out by development. Welcome to Northern Virginia. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where exactly this happened. But during the fighting at Blackburn's Ford, as I mentioned, this point in the war, both armies are brand new. Nobody knows what they're doing, essentially. This is really two armed mobs. There's all sorts of confusion on the battlefield because nobody at this point in the war has agreed that Union soldiers are going to wear blue, Confederate soldiers are going to wear gray. There are, by best estimates, over 200 different uniform combinations worn during the First Battle of Manassas. So, Union soldiers are wearing blue, gray, green, and red uniforms. Confederate soldiers are wearing blue, gray, green, and red uniforms. So, figure out who's who. So during the fighting, the 12th New York State Militia is going to be engaged in the fighting along Bull Run there at Blackburn's Ford. And through miscommunication of orders, one of the company commanders of the 12th New York is going to order his company to retreat and fall back. Soon enough, panic is going to spread throughout the rest of the 12th New York, and they are going to be fleeing for the rear. Leading into this will be a couple of Western New Yorkers. One of them was native of Batavia, Emory Upton, who was on the staff of Daniel Tyler at this point. Upton's going to try to rally the 12th New York. Also Patrick O'Rourke, who of course is an Irish immigrant, but will come home to, or will make Rochester his home and be killed on top of Little Round Top at Gettysburg in July of 1863. They're going to try to rally the 12th New York. Nothing is working though, but according to the eyewitnesses, Charles Rand stood there essentially by himself as the rest of his unit was falling back and continued firing at the Confederates in front of him. Now, he later admitted that the whole reason he didn't turn around was because he didn't want his back full of lead as he ran away. But for his stand there, Rand would later be awarded the Medal of Honor in 1897. And with the help, actually, of affidavits from former Confederates that would attest to Rand's stand there at Blackburn's Ford. And his Medal of Honor citation, which, by the way, make sure to go to the other end of the museum, you can see his Medal of Honor that he is awarded. The citation says, "The President of the United States of America, in the name of Congress, takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to Private Charles Franklin Rand, United States Army, for extraordinary heroism on July 18, 1861, while serving with Company K, 12th New York Infantry, in action at Blackburn's Ford, Virginia. Private Rand remained in action when a part of his regiment broke in disorder, joined another company, and fought with it through the remainder of the engagement." So not only is Rand often considered to be the first volunteer for the United States during the Civil War, but also he's sort of considered to be the first one not to receive the Medal of Honor because he won't get it until 1897, but he's one of the earliest actions that will be awarded the Medal of Honor. There's two Medal of Honor recipients from the 12th New York that day. Another fellow from Darien, New York, will get it as well. So Rand continued serving. This is a sketch of him, by the way, doing his stand there at Blackburn's Ford, and this is him later on in life. He continued serving throughout the war. He was wounded seriously in a battle outside of Richmond in June of 1862 and captured and brought to Libby Prison in Richmond, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. He would be exchanged. Because of his wound, he could no longer serve in the field during the remainder of the war, but he remained in the Army until the 1870s. And then he moved back here to Batavia, started his own medical practice after graduating from Georgetown University. And then when his mother died in 1892, he moved to Washington, D.C., and he remained there for the rest of his life until he died on October 14th, 1908. And he is buried, depending on which sources you read, the way that they've numbered graves in Arlington National Cemetery has changed quite a bit. But he's buried, according to some sources, again, in Section 1, Grave 1, which was supposedly reserved for the first volunteer of the United States during the war. So this is Charles Rand's grave today. There's me, of course, before I got the boot, walking around to find Charles Rand's grave. So it's very much, it's way in the back of the cemetery. But for those of you who have never been to Arlington National Cemetery, if you want to go, it is well worth your time there. And they have cool little computers in the visitor center, and you can find anybody's grave that you're looking for there. So that's the story of Charles Rand on July 18th. One other fun story, this is one thing I always say, there's two things that people know about the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run when they come down to that area on July 21st. And one is that's where Stonewall Jackson gets his name. And usually the other thing that people know is that civilians came out to watch the battle. And yes, this is true. Now the story has been blown up extraordinarily in the years since the Civil War, but certainly people did pack their buggies and carriages and bring picnic baskets with them, coming from Washington, D.C. out to watch this battle on Sunday, July 21st. Now most of them, you can see a few civilians down here watching as the Army goes away. A lot of people think that they were like right on the front lines watching this. Not true. In reality, they're about 5 miles away. This is about where they were standing. Again, I told you Centerville is a big, massive city now. So these are the heights of Centerville down here. Manassas battlefield is way over here. So pretty much all that they could see was smoke rising up above the trees themselves. But a few men, mostly United States congressmen that came out to see the battle, did venture a little bit closer. And one of them represented the 29th District, the House of Representatives, New York's 29th District, which was Monroe County. His name was Alfred Ely. There he is, very stern-looking man. Alfred Ely was born in Connecticut, but then he came to Rochester in 1835, became a lawyer there, and again he was elected to Congress in the election of 1860 to represent the 29th District. So he's there watching the battle. He ventured a little bit closer than he probably should have, and as he came to the area around the Stone Bridge, which this is the parking lot for the Stone Bridge today, that you can go, which crosses over Bull Run, right where the fighting started on the morning of July 21st. As he was getting closer and closer, a bullet hit the road right in front of him, and he very quickly dodged behind a tree and hid there for the remainder of the battle. Well, unfortunately for Alfred Ely, he hid a little bit too long, and he remained there during the course of the day, and spoiler alert, the Confederates would win the Battle of First Manassas, and so they're driving the Union troops away from Bull Run. And Alfred Ely is now going to find himself not protected by Union soldiers, but instead in the hands of Confederate soldiers, specifically soldiers from the 8th South Carolina. And so as they advance over the area through the Stone Bridge, supposedly all this is happening right about where the Bull Run Winery sign is today, as we like to say. Alfred Ely put himself in a good position, at least originally. When two officers of the 8th South Carolina found him, they asked him his identity, and he said, Alfred Ely. What state are you from, they asked. From the state of New York. Are you connected with the government? These South Carolinians asked. And Eli probably said this and then realized really quickly he should not have said this. He said, yes, I'm a representative in Congress. And so one officer grabbed Eli, took a pistol that Eli had with him and made him a prisoner. And they took Eli to their colonel, who was a fellow named E.B.C. Cash. And when Cash learned about who Eli was, I'm going to read this word for word because it's pretty incredible. Cash drew his pistol, pointed it right at Alfred Eli's head, and yelled to him, God damn your white-livered soul, I'll blow your brains out on the spot. And immediately, Eli started to try to run, and he was constantly ducking behind the two soldiers that had captured him. And so they're kind of playing like Ring Around the Rosie here. Cash is trying to get a good bead on Eli, and Eli is trying to make sure he's not within the line of sight of Cash. And Cash continued, he's a member of Congress, God damn him, came out here to see the fun, came out to see us whipped and killed, God damn him, if it was not for such as he, there would be no war, God damn him, I'll show him. Yeah, that's all a direct quote. Sorry, Mom. So, Alfred Ely is eventually going to be saved by a few nearby officers who will talk Cash down and say, you can't just shoot a civilian here, even if he's a member of Congress. And so Alfred Ely was actually made a prisoner of the Confederate Army. He was transported to Libby Prison in Richmond. This is a picture of Libby Prison, no longer stands today in downtown Richmond. And there he was a member of the prisoner corps there, if you will, for 6 months. Now, the unique thing about this, or the ironic thing, is Alfred Ely was one of these congressmen that was yelling, "On to Richmond, on to Richmond." And a lot of the Richmond newspapers joke that he made it to Richmond before anybody else. Of the Confederate Army rather than as a victor in arms. So Ely was eventually released. He was exchanged in December of 1861, moved back to Rochester. He served one more term in Congress, and then he died in Rochester in 1892, and he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery there in Rochester as well. Okay, so one more story from the Battle of First Manassas. If all these arrows and whatnot looks confusing, that's okay, because this is a very confusing battle. But who we want to focus on here, during the course of the fighting, again where the climactic action takes place at Henry Hill, 11 Union cannon will be ordered up onto the hill itself to basically try to blast the Confederate troops away. And that's not going to work out, but 5 of these guns were under the command of this gentleman here, Charles Griffin, who is not a Western New Yorker, but he's going to factor into the story here in a little bit. So Griffin is going to be leading, again, 5 of those 11 guns, what's called Battery D of the 5th United States Artillery during the course of the action. And unfortunately for Griffin, all of his guns will be captured, which as an artillerist, that was not anything you wanted to happen to your guns. You did not want your guns to fall into the hands of the enemy, no matter what. You would fight literally to the death to try to save them. Well, that didn't work out. Griffin survived. Many of his men and horses were killed, and again, he lost all 5 of his guns that he took up there at Henry Hill. Now, this is Griffin as an artillery captain. Later on in the Civil War, he actually became a general of infantry, of foot soldiers, and during a battle fought along the Potomac River in September of 1862, Griffin led a force of Union soldiers. They dashed across the river almost in the middle of the night at dusk, just as the sun was setting, and they managed to capture 4 Confederate cannon and bring them back to the northern side of the Potomac River. This was called the Battle of Shepherdstown, which is where I went to school, so I was always in love with this story. Well, when one of those guns was brought back to the north side of the Potomac River, Charles Griffin, who was known as one of the most volatile swearers in the entire Union Army during the war, became very excited because he recognized that one of those guns that his men had captured at Shepherdstown was one of the guns he had lost at the Battle of First Manassas in July 1861. So apparently you couldn't get Griffin to shut up about this for days on end. He was very, very excited. So something clearly was made of this in the Federal Army at that point. And while doing some research in the National Archives or Library of Congress, whatever it was, I stumbled upon a piece of paper that denoted all of the markings on that gun that Griffin had lost at First Manassas and then had recaptured at Shepherdstown in September 1862. And I thought, wouldn't this be cool if we could find this gun? It has everything we need. It's got all the markings on the gun. Wonder where it is. So months go by, nothing, couldn't find anything. And finally I was studying for some test in college or something, sitting in the library. And a friend of mine comes up to me with this huge red book. He says, very excited, he says, look what I just found. It's this book that has a list of every single known Civil War cannon and where it is today. So this gun was labeled as gun number 2. It was a model 1861 Parrott rifle. And so immediately I flipped to the back and went, where is this gun? Is this gun still around? Sure enough it is. It is part, there is gun number 2. This is when my dad and I went to go find it. It is part of the Civil War monument in the middle of Avon, New York. Right down the road. So, this is not the story of a person. This is the story of a gun. But what's pretty cool about this, so this gun was confirmed on top of Henry Hill on July 21st, 1861. It was confirmed at the Battle of Antietam, Battle of Shepherdstown in the Confederate Army. In September of 1862, this gun was put back into Griffin's original battery, Battery D of the 5th U.S. Artillery, and I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'm pretty sure that this cannon was on top of Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. So if you read in the news next week that as I'm driving back down to Virginia that there's cannon missing from the Avon Civil War, it wasn't me. But I always thought it would be cool to get that back down there. So you can go around, there's little plaques, there's 4 cannon actually. There's these little plaques here, and you're looking, if you want to go, you're looking for gun number 2 is the gun from Griffin's battery that was there atop Henry Hill. And of course they're celebrating Christmas. I'm glad they didn't project the cannon tube and lights itself. Okay, so real quick summary wrapping up the first battle. So all told, July 21st, 1861, between the two armies, there were about 5,000 soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured. So up to that point, it was the bloodiest single day in American military history, though within a year, that day would be eclipsed multiple times by other battlefields. And just to put into perspective, again, this is an early war battle, 5,000 casualties. People thought that was terrible. It certainly was. Of course, within a little over a year from that, you're going to have the Battle of Antietam, a one-day battle, 23,000 casualties in one day. Battle of Gettysburg, 3-day battle, 51,000 soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured. So the war is only going to escalate from there. And that will lead us to the Battle of Second Manassas in August of 1862. So to really put things, I'll give you the 30-second Cliff Notes version of how we get back to Manassas real quick. Union Army is going to depart Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1862 by boat. They'll sail down the Potomac River to the Virginia Peninsula. They're going to march up the Virginia Peninsula to Richmond. They'll get within 7 miles of Richmond. They will be defeated, thrown back. A second Union Army is going to be created in Virginia, known as the Army of Virginia, under the command of John Pope. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about John Pope. Fascinating guy, not well liked. He was referred to as an ass by some of his men. That's also a direct quote. But John Pope is going to face off against Robert E. Lee's army. Robert E. Lee is going to, you can see all these gray arrows here, divide his army, get behind Pope's men, and basically ransack John Pope's supply depot at Manassas Junction. Again, railroads, especially railroad junctions, are a great place to be able to store all of the supplies that an army needs. So Jackson's men are going to find all sorts of things. The only thing they won't find is whiskey and alcohol, because Jackson is going to order the barrels to be broken out onto the streets of Manassas. They will find things like lobster, candy, canned food, stuff that Confederate soldiers probably never dreamed of seeing in the field itself. And so eventually John Pope is going to find Stonewall Jackson's troops that have seemingly disappeared behind him in the area of Bristow Station and Manassas Junction. And Stonewall Jackson had moved his troops back behind an unfinished railroad, which you can see right where the laser pointer is, just north of the old Manassas battlefield. And John Pope found him. Pope's army found him on August 28th. Pope is going to attack him all day on August 29th. Nothing's going to work, and so Pope's going to do the same thing again on August 30th. Let's try to attack Robert E. Lee's army, at least Stonewall Jackson's portion of Lee's army. And that's going to lead us to an assault on the afternoon of August 30th, 1862. That was the largest Union attack that day. About 6,000 Union soldiers went forward. And included in those 6,000 soldiers was the 13th New York Infantry. They were known, one of several regiments known as the Rochester Regiment from this area. Mostly raised in Rochester, but a few companies from Dansville and Brockport as well. So the company was under the command of this fellow here, Elijah Marshall, who commanded 240 men of the 13th New York that day. Marshall was a graduate of West Point, class of 1850. He had been commended for bravery. For those of you who might know the Battle of Gettysburg, he served with Lewis Armistead, who was killed during Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863. Armistead had very good things to say about him. So a very good, no-nonsense soldier. In fact, he actually helped to raise soldiers from Rochester for the Union war effort in the spring of 1861. And when somebody asked him to make a speech to try to rally more men to the cause, Marshall's response was that he was not a speaking man, but a fighting one. And sure enough, the men of the 13th New York found out about that when he took command of the regiment in the spring of 1862. As one soldier put it, he said, "Our colonel is awful strict with us in camp, but for all that, the boys think a good deal of him. He is so brave when in a battle." That's exactly what these 240 soldiers would need as they moved forward on the afternoon of August 30th, 1862. Now this is what it looked like back then. You can see these very dense formations of Union soldiers. They walked right into, actually moved straight forward towards Stonewall Jackson's line. Little did they know the rest of the Confederate Army had extended the line off to their south. So basically they marched into and in between two Confederate forces. They were getting hit by artillery fire from multiple sides. One soldier from Massachusetts, as he marched across that field, said the field looked like, it reminded him of a mill pond in a rain shower because of all the artillery shells pocking up and cratering the ground as these Union soldiers were advancing and that they were charging across. Here's a picture today. So this is where the 13th New York started their attack. This is all open field here. You can still walk this trail today, one of my favorite trails of the battlefield. Way up here, right in front of the tree line, is the unfinished railroad cut that was known as the deep cut because this is the deepest cut. They're very creative with their names around there. The 13th New York advanced right to this position, right about where you see this tree here. But on their way doing so, as soon as they moved across this fence, Marshall said we got about one halfway across this open field when the fun stopped. And they made it within yards, literally yards, of the Confederate position there at the unfinished railroad cut. But they were not able to break through the position itself, the Confederate position. Eventually, after about 20 minutes of fighting there, Marshall ordered his men to withdraw. He said to have remained would have been to the entire annihilation of our commands. And in fact, 30 members of the 13th New York were killed in the attack, 75 were wounded, and 10 were captured. When the 13th New York came back to the safety of the woods where they had started their attack from, they counted 50 bullet holes through their flag. The flag was just left in ribbons, so it's amazing that more men ultimately weren't killed. One of the soldiers that was wounded, this young man here, 22-year-old Truman Robbins, he was a native of Leroy, just down the road from us here. He was only able to get off one shot before a Confederate bullet hit him in the throat. And he was carried from the field. He made it back to safety. He actually was put into a hospital outside of Washington, D.C. for a time. The surgeons were unable to actually remove the bullet from his throat, so he carried that with him. He actually made it back into the Army, though. This guy's tough as nails. And one day, while on campaign with the Army, he woke up in the middle of the night, had a huge coughing fit, and he actually coughed out the bullet 2 months after. So, yeah, how's that? So he survived. He actually lived until 1930, believe it or not. Yeah, so that's a great story for you. Next time you have a coughing fit, just think about Truman Robbins. Now, as for Elijah Marshall, he survived the attack here at 2nd Manassas. He actually survived the rest of the war at the very infamous Battle of the Crater fought outside of Petersburg, Virginia, where Union soldiers literally dug a mine underneath Confederate lines, filled it with gunpowder, and blew it up on the morning of July 30th, 1864, and then rushed troops into it. It was a very big mistake for the Union Army. But Marshall was wounded there and captured. And as he was being led to the rear, a Confederate officer started stripping him of his sash and his sword and his pistol and all this thing. And because Marshall just had the personality that he did, he actually personally appealed to Robert E. Lee to have all that returned to him. And according to the story, he got it all back, so he must have had a way with words, certainly. Now, Marshall came back to Rochester after the war. He died in 1883. He's also buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. But unfortunately, Marshall's story does not end in 1883 when he was buried in the ground there, because in June of 2000, somebody was out walking through the grounds of Mount Hope Cemetery near Marshall's grave and found bones scattered all over the place around Marshall's grave. Nobody was found, or they couldn't find who did it, but somebody actually dug up Marshall's grave, scattered his bones everywhere, his skull disappeared. No idea what this was for. But the crime is still unsolved today, but Marshall's remains, what was left of him, were put back in the ground there at Mount Hope Cemetery. So these stories they're not just from 150 plus years ago, they can still go on for quite a while. One last story that, here's the monument, by the way, that Union soldiers put up right where the 13th New York fought. They put this up in June of 1865, so it's one of the earliest Civil War monuments. So again, this is the open field behind the monument that 13th New York advanced up to and made it right to the railroad cut itself. Now this last story that I'm going to leave you with is not really a Western New York story, but it's a New York story, so I figured it was good enough. This gentleman here that you see on the right had a very martial name and a very American name. His name was Andrew Jackson Barney. He was 33 years old in 1862. He was from Belleville, New York, which is up close to Watertown, about 3 hours from here. But he had quite an interesting story. In 1851, there was a sickly officer in the United States Army that was looking to find a nice place to go to recover. And Barney's father was actually a dietary physician. And so the two crossed paths, Barney's father and this soldier. And Barney said, well, you're welcome to come and stay with me, and I can give you some advice and give you some medicines and whatnot. And so that soldier stayed with Barney's family for 6 weeks. That soldier was Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who, of course, eventually became Stonewall Jackson, one of the major Confederate figures in the Civil War. And so Barney grew up having known and becoming very close with Thomas Jackson, soon to be called Stonewall Jackson. Well, as twist of fate takes place, of course, the two men went different ways when the Civil War began. Barney pledged his allegiance to the United States. He'd been a New Yorker all of his life, pretty much. And when, similar to what happened here with Charles Rand, when there was a meeting in Belleville, New York, asking who would want to serve, Barney rose and said this country was dearer than life to him, and that he would go to be ready to start for Washington the next day. Eventually, by the time of August 1862, Barney was commanding the 24th New York Infantry that was involved in this attack, this very same attack, heading up toward the Confederate position at the Deep Cut itself. Now, Barney remained mounted on his horse during the attack, which of course is a great way to make yourself a target, but also a very inspiring way to lead your soldiers forward. So as the 24th New York charged forward right in the front lines, he yelled to them, "Forward, 24th," and as they approached closer and closer to the Confederate line, he yelled to them, "Come on," and leapt his horse up on top of the railroad embankment, with Union and Confederate forces literally on either side of the embankment. The fighting here would become very, very intense. Later on in the fight, as you can see in this painting here, Confederate soldiers literally resorted to throwing rocks at their Union counterparts, and Union soldiers threw the rocks back at them. Brief little action, but nonetheless, Barney mounted his horse, mounted it onto the top of the embankment, and started trying to yell for his soldiers to continue moving forward and to continue the attack. Supposedly, Confederate soldiers were so amazed by his bravery that they started yelling not to shoot him. Of course, in the din of battle, nobody's going to be able to hear that. And so Barney very quickly fell with a serious bullet wound to the head. He fell off of his horse. The horse dashed away. His body lay there motionless on top of the railroad embankment until a few Confederate soldiers were able to rise up, drag his body back to safety so he wasn't hit anymore by any more bullets. And ultimately, Barney would be carried back to the rear. On his way to the rear, he died. And as a few Union prisoners were carrying Andrew Jackson Barney's remains in a stretcher, they came by Stonewall Jackson, who looked at the remains and immediately recognized it to be his pre-war friend, Andrew Jackson Barney. And so Jackson wrote a personal letter of condolence to Barney's father, who had still remained close with, and made sure that Barney's remains were able to get through Confederate lines and taken back to Belleville, New York, where they still rest today. So that wraps up just a few of the stories of Western New York at Bull Run, and I hope I've been able to bring Bull Run and Manassas to you all a little bit as well, but you don't have to go too far to find any mention of Bull Run or Manassas here in Batavia. Of course, again, as I mentioned, just go to the other side of the museum here, and you can see Charles Rand's Medal of Honor that he receives for his actions at Blackburn's Ford, and this is a photograph from the monument just up the street. Of course, with Batavia native Emory Upton right on the front there, you can see Bull Run. This would be the first battle of Bull Run that they're talking about in Manassas here. So why two different names were used, I'm unsure of, because typically the Northern armies named those battles after Bull Run, and the Confederates referred to it as Manassas. But you can see that Western New Yorkers played a large part in the story of the actions that took place at Manassas over the course of 13 months between July 1861 and August of 1862. So thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have of me.
I understand that the Union Army typically used rivers, nearby rivers, to describe battlefields, and the Confederates used towns or villages or something like that. Could you expound a little bit on that?
Yeah, so the question is the naming system for battles. Typically, you're right, Union soldiers would have named their battles after the nearest geographic landmark. So in this case, Bull Run, which was the stream. Confederate soldiers would have named their battles after the nearest town, typically.
Sharpsburg.
Yeah, Antietam, Sharpsburg, Shiloh versus Pittsburgh Landing, etc. Now, I have never been able to find in all my years of studying the Civil War why that was the case. They couldn't agree on anything, of course, North and South at that time. I guess they couldn't even agree on naming the battle. But that's typically the way it went. But why that is, I've never been able to figure out. But yeah, that's usually the way it is. I'm trying to think of some other. So Fair Oaks is the Union name. Seven Pines is what the Confederates called it. So yeah, a lot of these battles went by multiple names, usually. Sometimes you'll see 3 or 4 different names for some of these battles, more than just 2. Any other questions? Yes?
Kevin, years ago, longer than what I really want to think about, we did an event here and recommissioned or whatever, a Confederate major that's buried in the Batavia cemetery. Do you know anything more about that story? All I can think of is Simeon Poole, but I'm not sure if that's.
Yeah, you missed my New York and Antietam talk. Yeah, no, that's Major Philemon Tracy of
Philemon Tracy,
6th Georgia.
yeah.
Yes, so he had an uncle who lived here in Batavia. He used to come up here on vacation several times a year as he worked his way up toward Yale University. And the story is that his uncle brought his remains back, and they had to actually disguise it as the burial of a Union officer. During the war, this was during the war, they brought his remains back. And so now he's buried just down the street off Harvester. And you can still see him today. Yeah, he's right by the road, actually. Supposedly, this is one of those claims that you never can really say for sure, but supposedly he's the furthest north Confederate officer killed during the Civil War that's buried. He's buried the furthest north of any Confederate officer killed during the war. Yep, and he's just down the street from here. So yeah, Philemon Tracy, 6th Georgia.
Philemon Tracy, right? Poole.
Yeah,
Another
yep.
Yankee outlet. I really
Yeah,
like
so
the Confederate, so forgive me for all that.
No, so yeah, if you drive along Harvester, you can see his marker right by in Batavia Cemetery. He has the Confederate Iron Cross in front of his grave, and there's an American flag in front of his grave.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was a nice ceremony in the city of Batavia.
Yep, yeah, so that's Philemon Tracy, his story there.
Tracy.
Mhm, Yep. Any other questions? Oh,
Go ahead.
2 brothers fighting. Cool.
Let the older guy go.
Yeah.
I mean, they had 2 battles of Bull Run, they were 13 months apart. What was going on in between? I mean, you said that the Union Army came around and tried to attack Richmond and all that. That was all those kind of things that were going on, and they ended up back in the same place again 13 months later.
Yeah, yep. So most of the fighting the Confederate armies around Manassas from May 1861 all the way to March 1862. And then they pull back closer to Richmond. Union Army follows them. There's fighting around Richmond itself, and then that's a Confederate victory. So basically, Robert E. Lee, that's when Robert E. Lee ascends to Confederate command, defeats the 1st Union Army that was closer to Richmond, and then essentially he learns that Union Army is being pulled away from Richmond and sent back up toward Washington, D.C. So Lee's decision is to move north and defeat this 2nd Union Army in Northern Virginia before the 2 Union armies can come together. And the reasoning that Manassas becomes a target again is John Pope's army, which is all these dark blocks here, is using the Orange and Alexandria Railroad to supply it. And Lee basically knows that the longer he waits, the more likely it is that he's going to be heavily outnumbered as these 2 Union armies come together. And so Lee decides to split his army in half. He sends Stonewall Jackson's wing, about 25,000 men. They march 50 miles in 36 hours. They will march all the way around the Union Army. They cut the Orange and Alexandria rail line at Bristow Station, which is one of the places that I work at in Prince William County, and then move up the line to Manassas Junction. And what the idea is that if they can cut Pope's supply line and get behind Pope, they're going to force Pope to move back in this direction closer to Washington and bring him to battle. So that's why, if you look at, I've seen some statistics, I can't remember off the top of my head, but most Civil War battles are fought within a few dozen miles of railroads. It was relatively new technology back then, 3 decades old or so by that point, but even then, people recognized the importance of railroads and moving troops and moving supplies, and so that's why railroads became such a key factor.
I've done a lot, obviously, with railroads, I've done a lot of reading, and I know about that,
Yeah, and Manassas really, even after the battles are fought there are soldiers in Prince William County for 4 years. It's not like a place like Gettysburg where they show up for a few days. They have a very terrible battle, but then they mostly leave. The people of Prince William County have no peace at all over 4 years. If it's not the Union Army, the Confederate Army's there. And so it's just because of the railroad. That's the whole reason they're there, because of the railroad.
You had mentioned Holland Cemetery, and I don't know if you knew this, Mercy from Rochester, New York, raised money and they went down to Gettysburg to pick up whatever wounded they could to bring them back. And that's how St. Mary's Hospital was actually founded, was as a result of them bringing them back. Nuns at that particular time were nurses for the most part, and so they administered to many of them, and some of them were Confederate, some of them were Union. And many of the Confederate soldiers were offered their paroles after they were cured, but they decided to stay. And so in Mount Hope Cemetery, when they all started passing away, they actually have a Confederate burial site for those soldiers who decided to stay in Western New York. They just like the weather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the weather. That's, you don't hear much about Western Europe.
Yeah.
Especially coming up from the south.
And you have to go way back into the cemetery to find it, but
Huh, okay.
there is a plot out there where there's Confederate soldiers that are buried out there.
I didn't realize that. I'll go find it on my next trip. And that's what I like to say, that's the idea is I had a hard time just whittling this down to 5 stories, local stories. There's so much more out there related to both battles of Bull Run and just in general of the Civil War as well. So, any other questions at all?
I'm gonna make your work, Kev. So.
All right.
So I'm gonna piggyback off 2 of these questions. So number 1, in terms of naming battles, Gettysburg, there's only one name, correct? There's no Union counter because it's the name of the town.
Yeah.
No Union counterpart to that.
No, both sides refer to it as Gettysburg simply, I think, because of the size of it.
Yeah.
And there were so many other landmarks that were fought over. Sometimes you will see soldiers referred to specifically, it all depends on where they fought, but some call it the Battle of Cemetery Ridge, Battle of the Round Tops.
Yep.
But that's usually if they fought right there. That's what they were. So a battle within the larger battle. Yeah. So Gettysburg typically just has one name.
Yeah. And there wasn't significant waterways along there except for small streams.
Right. Yeah.
Stream, Plum Run, and everything else like that. I remember reading about stories, and I'm sure you know about this because we talked about it many times, about Confederate and Union soldiers actually sharing canteens and everything like that. Just, trading tobacco for,
Coffee.
or whatever it might be. And
No
they were
spot in
perfectly
baseball
friendly. They
cards.
were perfectly friendly.
Yeah. Mhm.
During those truces, if you will, unofficial truces.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming out this evening. Thank you for Again, check out Charles Rand's Medal of Honor. It's right down the hallway from here, which is pretty neat. And Ryan, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again.
Well, thank you again, Kevin. Another amazing presentation. Yes, so thank you everybody for coming out. Just a quick PSA about some upcoming events. We're keeping the Civil War theme going. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock is our next Java with Joe, and our curator Tyler will be doing a presentation on famous women of the Civil War, including spies, soldiers, and everything in between. So if you're on the Civil War kick, you want to keep going, we got you. We'll also be having some kids programs throughout the summer on Saturday mornings, once a month for the next couple months. So if you got any little ones that are really into history, bring them on by. We've got more coming up for August. We've got more guest speakers. Our next trivia, which will actually be at Go Art down the street. It's going to be on the 1960s, so stop on by for that. And it's pop culture, multiple choice, so don't worry if you don't know the history. It's okay, I got you covered. So there's always something happening at the Holland Land Office Museum. Our calendar is full, but the best way to know about it, and this is going to be my sales pitch, so hopefully everybody gets really into it, is to become a member of the museum, as you get notified before everybody else when things are going on, and you get free admission, you get discounts to all the events like this, so you get a ton of benefits to do it, and it starts out at $25 for the year, so it's definitely a worthwhile investment. It helps us do all of this stuff and pack the house like we did tonight. So thank you, everyone, and be sure, yes.
Quick question for you. Why is it called Holland?
That's not a quick question.
No, I'll give you the quick answer. So the Holland Land Company was established in Holland, the Netherlands, and basically they
The
bought
Dutch-
land
The Dutch came
to
here?
sell it. Well, the Dutch didn't really come here, they paid people to work it for them.
Oh, okay.
And that's where Joseph Ellicott and that group kind of comes in. They are working for the land company, but it's the Holland Land Company. They build an office, so it's the Holland Land Office.
Gotcha, okay.
So there's your very quick version.
Thanks.
But if you want to know more, come back and I'll tell you more.
Just one question, with the Holland Land Office in the Netherlands, why here in Batavia? Other states, other countries too?
Man, you guys are just testing me. He was the one supposed to answer the question. not me.
Your show now.
I know. So another quick answer, they were looking all over the new United States.
Okay.
Their first purchase is actually in western Pennsylvania, and Joseph Ellicott does the surveying for that. But their general agent, Casanova, eventually is able to strike a deal in Philadelphia with Robert Morris, who owned this area before, and he wanted to sell it. So it really was just opportunity, and the land was very desirable too. Because they actually looked at some in actually up in, I believe the Maine region, but it was not a great area, and people weren't necessarily looking to go there, so they decided against doing that. But yeah, so that's the, again, two-sentence answer for that. But again, I can tell you a lot more at another time, so.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.